Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome, everyone. Sorry we're a little bit late on this talk. Usually I try to get a talk in on Thursday evening. It should be published by Friday, but there's been a lot going on this week. So inshallah, better late than never, as they say. Hopefully we'll be more regular. But this talk is a very important talk for those who are interested in Sufism. And the title of the talk is In Defense of Sufism. Now, we shouldn't really have to be defending Sufis and Sufism. And for most of the Islamic history, all the way back to the 8th century when it was first named, there was no issue. Sufism, or Tasawwuf as it was called, was considered one of the Islamic sciences. And although there are people like Ibn Taymiyyah or other people who criticize some particular Sufis or some particular aspects of the practice, no one was against Sufism. In fact, I was told that in the old days, if you traveled to either Pakistan or Turkey, Sufism was so well accepted that after they asked you if you were Muslim, they asked you which tariqat, which Sufi group. So it was that intrinsic a part of Sufism. But ever since the end of World War I, actually, when the Ottoman Empire fell, and the control of the holy sites and a lot of Islam went to Saudi Arabia through all kinds of political machinations, then the Wahhabi movement of Saudi Arabia started criticizing Sufism. And now, wherever you go in the Muslim world, it's hard to avoid people who want to criticize the Sufis. Now, this is not to say that there aren't Sufis who do wrong things, that there aren't Sufis who are corrupt in various ways. I've run into many of them on my journey. But Sufism itself is not corrupt. Sufism itself is the essence of Islam. It's the deepest level of our religious practice. So when you go back to look at what is a Sufi, okay, now this also gets complex and muddled and confounded. What is a Sufi? And the answer is very simple. If I had an audience here, I would ask them to see how they defined it. A Sufi is an Islamic mystic, period. That's the end of it. Just like what is a Muslim? A Muslim is a believer. And then you can say, what does he believe in? He believes in the holy books, he believes in the prophets, he believes in the angels, believes in the day of judgment. A Muslim is a believer, a Sufi is a mystic. Period, end of sentence. All the religions have mystics. You know, the Christians have their monks, and the Jews have their Kabbalists, and now the Haridim or the Hasidim. The Hindus and Buddhists are practically, mysticism is the major part of their religion. In Buddhism, I would say the religion is a mystical practice, period. In Hinduism, there are some devotional aspects as well, but mysticism is an intrinsic part. You'll never hear a Hindu criticizing the notion of guru unless they're some very modernist people. You'll never hear a Buddhist criticizing the search for truth or enlightenment. It's part of their tradition. And it's part of our Islamic tradition also, except there's been a lot of negative propaganda for whatever reason. The real reason is spiritual materialism. That is, the real reason is practitioners of our religion that don't understand that there's a deep inner aspect. And you can go very far in that deep inner aspect, and that's always what interested me more than anything. Forgot to put on the timer again. No problem. So I imagine a few minutes. Okay. So Now, if you go and look this up, anywhere, almost anywhere, whether the source is Islamic or Wikipedia, they go into all this semantic nonsense. As my beloved histology teacher, Dr. Clermont, used to say, this is completely irrelevant. Whether Sufi comes from Suf, which means wool, which were the cloaks that some of the early Sufis wore, or whether it comes from Safa, meaning purity, or whether it comes from Akhal Suf, the people of the bench, all of that is irrelevant. What its etymological origin is purely irrelevant. But scholars love this kind of irrelevancy. Hopefully we will be able to avoid it. The Sufi is a mystic with spiritual practices, usually almost always connected with a sheikh, a leader of a tariqat, one of the ways, and the student, the murid, takes his bayat, takes the hand of the sheikh, and agrees to follow the practices and guidance of that sheikh. That's the basic structure of Sufism. Okay. Now, there are a lot of groups around that are many of them very good, pious people of sincerity, who other people say, or sometimes they themselves say, they're Sufis and they aren't. Okay, so these are the group. I'm not sure what to call these people, but it can create some confusion, and it has, and I've heard the confusion often, as to what is Sufism. So I would call these people, let's say, and these movements, Sufi style, amongst the practitioners, or not even the practitioners, the Jewish people, those who don't want to follow the religion, they don't eat kosher. They eat kosher style. Okay, so it's no longer really following the rules. So there are a lot of people around who are Sufi style. It's not that they're not following the rules, but their primary intention is not mystical. What is mysticism? Mysticism is the practice, the desire to have an experiential knowledge of Allah as separate from one or as one's very essence. What the Vedantists call non-dual understanding, non-dual Vedanta, i.e. us and Allah are one, or dualistic knowledge, we and Allah are separate, as the scholars will tell us, and there's a truth to that also. So what is that? First page, first teaching of Sufism that I received said the following on the Shadli teaching. On this way we walk on two legs, Sharia and Hakika, the law and the absolute truth. For some reason, whatever, the Muslims sometimes are reticent. What do they call it now about vaccine skeptics? They're mystical skeptics. Okay. They have a problem with this inner knowledge. And so they lean more towards the scholastic side, scholarship, which is fine. But we shouldn't confuse Sharia with Hakika. Now, one of the justifications and the explanations, which I think is wrong, that you'll see about Sufism is related to a very well-known hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The angel Jibreel came to him and asked him, what is Islam? What is Iman? What is Islam? What is Ihsan? And the Prophet answered each of these questions very properly. You can look up the hadith. And then, so the scholarly types, if you want the academic types, They said, there's Sufis who wanted to justify Sufism is ihsan. Wrong. Look up, if you know how to use an Arabic dictionary, that isn't totally connected with the religion, but is about the language. There's nothing in the definition of hasana, which is the 3-letter root, ihsan, that says experiential knowledge of God. That says experience, period. Hasan means beautiful, good. Ihsan means it's more beautiful. It's true that Sufism is more beautiful, but more beautiful does not define Sufism. It's just an adjective. So it's incorrect, in my view, to say that Sufism is ihsan. Ihsan is the top level of Sharia, of the dualistic understanding of reality. Okay, it's good, no doubt about it. It's excellent, in fact. One of the definitions of ihsan is excellence. Ihsan is excellent, but it's not Sufism. Now, another place we get into trouble here is in black and white thinking. And this has been, it's all over my Facebook page these days with everything going on in the Middle East. It's all black or white. So if Sufism is good, it must be everything else. And if Sufism is bad, it must be all wrong. This is complete nonsense. This is ignorance. Okay, so there are some Sufis who may be bad. There are some scholars who may be bad. There are some scholars who may be awliya Allah. They're saintly, but they're not Sufis. So the correct word for Sufism, there's a number of words, if we're looking for words for Sufism, it's not ihsan. This is intellectual justification. The correct word for Sufism is marifat, okay, which means knowledge, but the knowledge of Allah in an experiential sense. Okay. Other names that you'll find very closely connected with the essence of Sufism is fana and baka. We had a tape on this. You can look at the list of names, fana and baka. Those are essential experiences of Sufism. In the last tariqat I was with, there were 4 stages. The 3rd stage is fana, the 4th stage is baka. What do they mean? Fana refers to annihilation. Annihilation of the ego. Once the ego is annihilated, what remains? Baka is what remains. What remains is Allah, the divine consciousness. Okay, so marifat, fana, and baka, if you need some terms, not ihsan. Okay, those are all terms for Sufism. Now, in some of these Sufi style groups or para-Sufi groups, I'm going to name 2 because they're very good. Okay, so watch the black and white thinking. I'm not saying anything against them. They're very good people. Many of them are awliya Allah. They're pious. They're surrendered. They're headed for salvation. There's no doubt about it. They're not Sufis. Okay. 2 groups that I've spent a lot of time with. They were my default position every time I had a falling out with one of the shiuch in Sufism. I continued, but in the meantime, my default position was either the Tabligh, that a lot of Muslims know, and the Habaib. Okay. They are not Sufis. In both cases, there was Sufism at one point, but no longer. The originator of the Tabligh movement, Maulana Ilyas and Maulana Zakaria, were Sufis. But that Sufism is no longer present. But what you get is, you get some of the practitioners, they do a little bit of Chisti dhikr from time to time. We do it in our Visal. La ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah. Yes, they do the zikr, but their priority, their primary consideration is being in taqwa, being pious, being virtuous, not in realizing the experience of Allah. Now, we've had okay, before we get to some other scholarly types, the Habaib are another group. I had the privilege of meeting one of their great teachers in Jeddah with my ex-wife just before he passed on. And he told us directly. Now, there are people in the Bible who may deny this and say, oh, he didn't tell you the whole truth, that Sufism was over in their in their way. They're no longer a Sufi way. He said, we no longer give bayat, people can't hold it. So what are they? They're a group of scholars. They're a group of for Islamic revival. They have a huge amount of knowledge, a lot of piety, a lot of sincerity, but the Sufism isn't there. How do I know? To be sure, I could tell, well, the teacher told me that, but I also met some of the people. One of them, he will go unnamed right now because I don't want to besmirch anyone's reputation, but let's say he's one of the most famous of their scholars of the Habaib, and I asked him, what is fana? Okay. I'm not claiming to be the grand Sufi expert, but I have had the experience of fana. Not for as long as I would have liked, but so I know what I'm talking about when I talk about fana. It's a very specific experience. When I asked him about it, it was very clear he hadn't had it. He gave me an intellectual explanation, and you can tell, I can tell, I think most people can tell when someone gives you mental elaboration and when someone talks from their experience. He wasn't talking from experience. He didn't know about it. And there are a lot of people like that. Now, if we go back in history, one of the most famous scholar, probably the greatest Islamic scholar ever, Imam Ghazali. And remember, no black and white thinking. I'm not saying anything negative about his state, his sincerity, his knowledge, his piety, his sainthood. Imam al-Ghazali, from everything I read and experienced, he's in all probability the greatest scholar in Islam, but he's not a Sufi. And when I sensed that, but when I needed to be sure of what I'm saying, I found a few quotes. One is summarizing his thinking, but this one is a direct quote in the book by Ibn Attila. You're free to have a look at it. He quotes him directly saying, the highest degree, okay, where should we start on this? Okay, the highest degree of gnosis, that's marifat, that his servants can attain is the realization that true Gnostic knowledge of him, Allah, is impossible. Wrong, wrong, and wrong for them. Furthermore, no one can know that it's in its totality. No one can know that in its totality except a prophet or a righteous saint. Whatever. I can't answer to that. But as for the prophet, he has clearly expressed this by saying, I cannot enumerate the ways of praising thee. Thou art as thou hast praised thyself. How you get from there to say that you can't have the final realization, I don't know. But this is what scholars do. They take a little bit of actual text, hadith or Quran, and then they make logical extensions to it. Thou hast praised thyself. As for the righteous saint, okay, here's the key phrase. As for the righteous saint, he says, the incapacity to attain realization is a realization. Wrong. Again. The incapacity to attain realization is because you don't have the proper sheikh, you don't have the proper method, or you don't have the idhn of Allah. But it's definitely a possibility, and Sufis throughout history have attained realization. We will talk more about this when we do a series called The Sufi of the Week, which will start after Ramadan. Before that, we'll cover other issues. So, oddly enough, Imam Ghazali was not a Sufi, but the one who's used most of the time to criticize, the scholar who is used most of the time by the Wahhabis to criticize the Sufis, Ibn Taymiyyah was one. There was times where he was wearing the mantle of the Qadiris. And his criticism is not a global criticism of Sufism like the Wahhabis do. It was very selective, and there were parts of Sufism that he accepted and other parts that he criticized. And I've seen other sources where he was actually a Sufi murid at one point and a Sufi sheikh at another point. And this is the one that, for example, the Wahhabis are using to criticize Sufism. So it makes no sense. So be aware, because I've had discussion with people, I'll try not to name specifics, but there are some terrific scholars out there, and people say they're Sufis and they're not. What they do, again, black and white thinking. What they do, the good scholars, the scholars of integrity, they defend Sufism. They say, yes, it's part of Islam. That's very different from being a Sufi. A Sufi has to be committed to the ultimate realization, not to defending the process or the groups or the shiuch or whatever else. We love the defenders of Sufism, and we're appreciative of them because they defend us against the Wahhabi heresy, if you want. But that doesn't make them Sufis. So there's, as I said earlier on, every tradition, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, they all have mysticism at its core. In Islam, that core is called Sufism. There were times when there were Sufi teachers all over the world. Now they're hard to find. Very hard to find. And even when there's a legitimate Sufi teacher, often they don't find successors. One of the famous Sufis that we'll talk about in future talks, most famous perhaps Sufi, Jalaluddin Rumi. Okay. He started a tariqat that was called Mevlevi, okay, where most people know the whirling dervishes, even the non-Muslims, they love the whirling dervishes. But we met one of the last representatives, again, I don't know why this happens to me, in Konya, near Jalaluddin Rumi. His name was Suleiman Dede. And he said to us, again, he said, our way is cut. There is no Mevlevi. So if you're listening to the translations of Coleman Barks, it's beautiful poetry, but it's not Sufism. He said, our way is cut. He was in his 90s. He said, there's no one to follow me, no one in my family, no one in my followers can carry this tariqat. It's over, the Mevlevi way. There's still people claiming to be Mevlevi, but there are people claiming to be everything. So if you want to find an authentic Sufi sheikh, you're going to have to look very far. Or contact me personally, I may be able to lead you into it. But the vast majority of people who claim to be Sufi sheikhs now aren't. Some of them are corrupt. Some of them will lead you to leave everything, because when you run into, this is a whole other issue, but if you run into a corrupt sheikh, it can destroy everything, not only your tariqat, but even your faith in the religion, and people leave the religion because they're disappointed with the sheikh. So this is a treacherous path. And those who persist in it are going to have to overcome a lot of obstacles and a lot of negative experience, but keep going, because we, include myself in the group, we're determined to have that realization and to increase that realization and to maintain that realization. What the Hindus and the Buddhists call enlightenment, what the Christians call Christ consciousness, and I'm not sure what the Hasidim call it, but I'm sure there's some terms for something similar in the Kabbalah. So this is our way. This is what I'm giving these talks about. And this is what we're working on. This is our priority. That is Sufism. You're invited to join. We have these sessions on YouTube. We have a local session in Montreal called the Wisal, where we do collective dhikr. I have found it doesn't work long distance, unfortunately. You have to be present there. We do that locally in St. Anne de Bellevue. And we're doing everything we can to spread this way. It's quite rare in the modern world, but you can still find it if you look enough. May Allah help us in this way and help us to spread the way, because from everything I've seen, and I've studied Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism, this is the gold standard. Sufism is the gold standard of mysticism, and it includes balance. We follow the Sharia, but we also follow the Hakika, the search for the truth. Okay, so it's a way of balance and it's a way of elevation. May Allah help us in this way to get higher and higher station, and to be His humble servants, and to be an instrument for the delivery of His truth. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun, wa salamun ala mursalin, wa alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Al-Fatiha. See you next week, inshallah.